Welcome to Restoring the Truth, and today we're concluding our research into the land of Shinar and the Tower of Babel. While studying the land of Shinar over the years, and particularly over the past year, I've realized much of what we believe about the ancient locations mentioned before the flood and shortly after the flood, when they were named, how they got their name, sometimes even their boundaries, doesn't line up with deep research of the Bible and the ancient books quoted by the Bible. Proverbs 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings to search out a matter." Not much is said about Ararat or Shinar, and I believed that these two places, as well as all the places mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, to be places that were named before the flood. But I've been challenged to allow God to change some of the things I believe till I can see in the scripture proof of those things. So until I see it in His Word for myself and understand it, I'm going to continue to be willing to be teachable by the Holy Spirit. And that's part of what this channel really is about, is to also pass that challenge on to you. You know, we can continue to believe in the fairy tales that we believe in, and I believed in fairy tales, or we can allow the Holy Spirit to show us the truth and to speak to us. That's what I've chosen to do. I said yes, and I just want to challenge you to do the same thing. So I had to go back to the beginning in order to understand how, when, and why these places were named leading up to the time of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Now, the first book written was Enoch, and I found a great search tool that I'm going to link to. If you have an Android device, it allows you to search the book of Jasher and Enoch as well as the Bible. I would encourage you to listen a few times and read the verses I've given you if you want to understand this part of history, as I'm going to go well beyond Shinar and the Tower of Babel in order to give you an accurate picture of the ancient map of the world from the beginning and just after the flood. Please read Jasher chapters 7 through 16 and Genesis 10 through 14. I'm giving you the tools you need to read it in order to understand what was common knowledge in their day. I read these scriptures until it felt like common knowledge to me. Kind of like watching a movie. You could see the movie 10 times and think you know everything about it, until someone starts asking you questions. What was the color of the room? What was the color of the carpet? What was the picture on the wall? What was written on that sign over there? What was her brother's name? And you really start to grill somebody on, all the intimate details of every scene in the movie. You realize you don't know anything about that movie. You thought you did. You thought you knew everything about it. You knew the plot. But you didn't know all the intimate details, all the minute details about it. And when you watch a movie or you read something over and over again, each time you pick up something new and something different. And it's kind of a compounding event. The more you go, the more you learn, the more you're capable then of understanding other things that you overlook. So please take these tools and read these chapters. You never thought I was going to give you homework, did you? You never saw this one coming. But please read. Genesis 2:10 through 14 says, "A river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted. It became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison. That is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and onyx stone, and the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. The name of the third is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates." Now, the river Pison isn't mentioned in Enoch or Jasher, and Havilah is strangely absent from the book of Enoch and is first mentioned in Jasher 7:10 when Havilah is born. The Gihon River is mentioned in Jasher 2 and 6, but Ethiopia is also absent from Enoch and Jasher. Ethiopia is identified as the land of Cush, and the first mention of Cush was when he was born, Jasher 7:10. The Gihon River overflowed and flooded and killed a third of mankind at that time. And so it's interesting. It seems that they hadn't at that point spread out and occupied the world because one river was able to flood and kill 1/3 of the population. The river Hiddekel is also absent from Enoch and Jasher, and Assyria, which is named after Asher, isn't mentioned until Jasher 7:15 when he was born. The Euphrates River first appears in Jasher 13:18, which is after the Tower of Babel. It also mentions the rivers Mitzrim, which was named after the guy named Mitzrim, and was first mentioned in Jasher 7:10 when he was born. Mitzrim is the land of Egypt. So we see that these places were named after people. None of these places were mentioned in Enoch, which was written before the flood, and all of them were born after the flood. The first mention of any of these names was when they were born. So what can we take away from this? First, a little history. In Enoch, he was 65 when he became king, and he was 308 years old when Adam died, because Adam died in the 243rd year of the reign of Enoch when Lamech was 56. So Enoch became king the same year that Methuselah, his son, was born. Methuselah was the father of Lamech, who was the father of Noah, who was the father of Shem. The flood was 1,656 years after creation. You can prove that in 3 or 4 different ways. It's not even in question at all. 2 years after the flood, Shem had Arphaxad. Arphaxad was 35 when he had Salah, who had Eber at 30. Eber was 34 when he had Peleg. Abram was 48 when Peleg died. Peleg lived to be 239 years old. It was shortly after the men were scattered to the 4 corners of the earth from the Tower of Babel. Probably the same year, but we know that this took place when the earth was divided among the nations. This was when the nations were formed, and everybody is thinking, this was Pangea. Yeah. This was when the earth was divided among the nations. You can read this in Jasher chapter 9 and 10. You can read this in Genesis chapter 10 and 11. And you will find they are both identical, talking about the exact same thing. Jasher's just a little more clear. They're both talking about the same thing. This is when the earth was divided. This is at the Tower of Babel, after the confusion at the Tower of Babel, when men were scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. In the early days of Peleg, the nations were born. The latter days, which was the year he died, or right at the year he died, the men were scattered from the Tower of Babel throughout the earth. This was 340 years after the flood. Jasher 7:19 says, in the days of Peleg, the sons of men were divided, and in the latter days the earth was divided. So we can see that the book of Jasher is correct, that in the early days, men were born who had nations named after them. Asher, Canaan, Cush, Abraham was the father of many nations, so on and so forth. And in the latter days, they were divided at the Tower of Babel. 6 generations later, Moses is born, with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kehath, Amram, and Moses. And Jacob was 50 when Shem died. Now Moses was armed with 6 more generations of history. And the earth now is fully occupied and nations are now established. You had the one river, Gihon, overflowing and killing 1/3 of the population of mankind. Now, if that was to happen again, men are scattered throughout the earth. They were not before. Now they are, and it might be tragic, but it wouldn't kill a third of the population, one river overflowing, because everybody's not living on the river. They're scattered now throughout the entire earth. Nations are formed. Nations are now named. I mean, these pieces of land are not vacant anymore and nameless, or they don't live under the reign of one enormous, unopposed empire. The nations are now divided. The earth is divided. It's occupied. And so Moses is able to assign names when he wrote the Torah to these places as he describes the creation. But these places were not named when creation took place because the men they were named after were not yet born. I once thought, okay, cool. Wow, these places was already named. No, they were not. Moses wrote the Torah. These places were not named in Jasher until they were born. They were not mentioned in Enoch because they were not yet born. But they're mentioned in Genesis right off the get-go in Genesis chapter 2 because Moses wrote the Torah and he was on the other side 6 generations later, armed with all this information and able to give a description of this place now that the nations have been established. Jasher 10:5 says, they built cities and called them after their own names or the names of their children or after their particular occurrences. Jasher 10 has this taking place after the Tower of Babel. Jasher 10 and 9, 10, 11 and Genesis 10 are giving the same account. Jasher 10 has this taking place after the Tower of Babel. Genesis 10 appears to be before the Tower of Babel, but it says they were divided because it talks about the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. But in chapter 10, it says they were divided by their language. And they all spoke the same language before the Tower of Babel confusion. So we know that this took place after the Tower of Babel. And it just as it shows that it does in Jasher. It's just not in chronological order at that particular point, which is no way you can argue that. They were all spoke the same language until after the confusion. So the places that we can prove existed before the flood are Eden, Nod, the city of Enoch, the river of Gihon, Mount Sinai, and Mount Hermon. Eden was probably named by Adam. It means pleasure. Jasher 1:33 says, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and he went moving and wandering in the land toward the east of Eden, but it doesn't mention the name of the land. Once again, they named places after their names, their children's names or occurrences. Nod means wandering, until Cain defined the boundaries of the land by where he wandered in it. How could it have a name or a meaning? So this was probably named by those who were living in that time and observed this. It would have been common knowledge and gossip, I'm sure. This is what we do today. We name, places after, they actually have a meaning, something we witnessed, something we lived, someone we know. Then we have the city of Enoch named after Cain's son. Next, we have the river Gihon in Jasher 2 and 6. It says the Lord caused a flood there, which destroyed a third of the population. At that time, we already covered that. Enoch 1:4 mentions Mount Sinai, but we don't know the meaning of Sinai or how it got its name. But Enoch knew Adam, and he was 308 years old when Adam died. So it could have been named by Adam. Enoch 7:7 says that 200 angels descended on Ardis, which is the top of Mount Armon. It was called Armon because they made a binding oath there. Well, once again, and of course this is talking about Genesis chapter 6, we see that this was named after an occurrence. It didn't just make up the name. What do you want to call this mountain? Oh, Armon. No, it had a meaning. It was named after an occurrence, just like we witness today. This is what we do today. That's what they did then. So we're about to see again. Now, Ararat is only mentioned twice in the Bible, Genesis 8:4 and Jeremiah 51:27. But when you search for the actual Hebrew word, it is used 4 times. But twice it is translated as Armenia. 2 Kings 19:37 and Isaiah 37:38. When you look up Ararat in Genesis 8:4, it's referring to a mountainous region in eastern Armenia and not a specific mountain. The meaning of Ararat is what fascinated me the most. Hidden in the meaning of the Hebrew word Ararat is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. The curse reversed is what Ararat means, the curse reversed. And I thought that was interesting because it's like, wait a minute, I read that in Enoch. Enoch 81:2 says that the book of Enoch was to be preserved for future generations. Noah had this book of prophecy, and he had this particular prophecy with him on the ark. The proof of that is that the apostles quoted from it several thousand years later. And in fact, Enoch said that he was not writing that book for that generation, but for a generation far, far off. But in it was this prophecy about Noah and what they were going through at that time. Now, you should read all of Enoch chapter 10. Enoch is, it just way over my head when I read it. But, Genesis chapter 10, it's still worth reading it at least once, or listen to it if you can get the audio from J.C. Marsh. But verse 10 says, "Restore the earth which the angels have corrupted, and announce life to it, that I may revive it." So if you read Enoch, it really is pronouncing a curse on the earth because of the angels, the fallen angels, and the things that they did, and they corrupted everything. They corrupted man. They corrupted. You read, the Enoch and Jasher. They corrupted everything. The animals, man's genetics, and the plants, and just about everything. Enoch said the earth was cursed because of sin, but this prophecy pronounced that life and righteousness would be restored. The curse would be reversed, basically. When the ark landed, after this horrific judgment, they had no idea where they were. In fact, most likely no man had ever set foot there. It would have been unrecognizable, just like, your neighborhood after a tornado, but much worse. They had the prophecy from Enoch, and when they landed after being afloat for a year, evidence suggests that they named the place after the fulfillment of that prophecy. The curse now is reversed. They've been afloat for a year, and just like Jacob had the encounter with God, and he made a pillar there, and it was replaced to be remembered by Israel, but yet this isn't where he lived. And they did not remain in Ararat. Jasher 6:41 says, "They went back and returned everyone to his place, and Noah and his sons dwelt in the land that God told them." So they landed, and they actually stayed in the ark, even though it was dry, until a full year had been completed, and God told them to come out of the ark. They were waiting for his instructions, so they'd been locked up in that ark. And when they get out, the curse is indeed reversed, and they head straight back to where they came from. And the evidence, because that's what God told them. God told them where to go. But they named that place Ararat, the curse reversed. The evidence shows that they returned to Jerusalem because it was called the house of Noah when Abram lived there. He was in hiding from Nimrod for 39 years, and it was later, we know, called Salem. Shem was king and priest of Salem, which is Jerusalem, later became Jerusalem. And of course, he couldn't be king and priest when there was nobody there, when Abram was in hiding there. But as the population grew, and he lived 600 years total, then he was able to become king. As now there was enough people to actually have a kingdom. The first mention of Shinar is in Jasher 7:43. It says they built him a large and extensive city. And Nimrod called the name of the city that he built Shinar. Why did he call it Shinar? Well, once again, they named after their children or after their own name or after occurrences. In this case, for the Lord had vehemently shaken his enemies and destroyed them. Then it says his kingdom became very great. In the early days of his kingdom before the Tower of Babel, the world had not yet been colonized and was mostly uninhabited. So there was nothing to oppose the kingdom of Shinar from extending as far as Nimrod desired except one thing: geography. In this picture, we can see a large mountain range called the Himalayas. This is also referred to as the roof of the world. It is the highest plateau on Earth and a natural border. It is a border that exists today between Nepal and China and between India and China. Now, one verse that I struggled to understand was Jasher 9:23, and it says that all the families assembled, consisting of about 600,000 men, and they went to seek an extensive piece of ground to build the city and the tower. And they sought in the whole earth, and they found none like one valley at the east of the land of Shinar, about 2 days' walk. And they journeyed there, and they dwelt there. So according to this verse, they journeyed to the east until they came to the border of Shinar. Then they walked about 2 days beyond the border of Shinar, where they found a valley. That's what it says. You break it down, that's exactly what it said. And they settled there in the valley. Haven't yet built a tower, haven't done anything, but all the families assembled, consisting of 600,000 men, and they went to seek an extensive piece of ground to build the city and the tower, and they sought in the whole earth. They found one valley at the east of the land of Shinar, about 2 days' walk, and they journeyed there and dwelt there. So, I mean, this wasn't like, well, they just walked 2 days and there it was. No, the place was found, and then they journeyed there. The location was, because, I mean, they obviously searched the whole earth. You know, that 600,000 people didn't go search the whole earth in one big group. All right, let's go look over here. Now, all 600,000 of us are going to go over there, and then all 600,000 of us. Now, they split up. It was probably a time frame, and we'll meet back here, in X amount of days. And so the location was found. There was none like it because it was the highest location. The highest elevation. It's 15,060 feet above sea level is this valley where these lakes are. The lake is 15,064 feet above sea level. This is the lake in the bottom of the valley at that level. There's no place like this on Earth. It's a very large valley. It's about 400 miles long, about 50 miles wide or something like that. There is no other place like this. And so they found it, the location, and then they journeyed there. But the location is 2 days east of the border of Shinar, where the valley is. That's the valley where these two lakes are. We can see the valley right there. Now, so we can identify the eastern border of the land of Shinar at the peak of Nimrod's empire before he built the Tower of Babel. And, of course, the Tower of Babel is right there on the other side of that valley. But this was before he built the tower, before his failure at the tower, before he was defeated by Chedorlaomer, before he went to battle with Chedorlaomer against Sodom and Gomorrah, resulting in his defeat by Abraham, because Abraham came back to get his nephew Lot and defeated all those kings and brought Lot back. This was before the earth was divided among the nations in the latter days of Peleg, before the nations were formed, before they were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and the earth, before the earth was occupied. At the peak of Nimrod's, that was the border. And this is a natural border that we can still see today. It's still a natural border here today. It's just a natural border. And it's still, that same border is followed today between Nepal and India, and Nepal and China, and India and China. And we've already established that the city of Shinar was named Babel or Babylon after the confusion at the tower. Both Shinar and Babel are recognized as being the first city that Nimrod built. It says the first city he built was Shinar. Then later it said the first city he built was Babel. And then the Bible says the first city he built was Babel. So how can two cities be the first one that he built? Well, if they're the same city and you change the name, that's the only way that both cities can be the same. And they are the same. He ruled from Shinar, and it says, Jasher says he was still in Shinar he was still in the land of Shinar during the building of the tower. Because he was the king, he was the ruler. He wasn't, mixing the mortar and laying the brick and climbing the structure. He was the king. He was given the instructions and the commands, and that is confirmed by the fact that they said that they died through his means at the tower, and that's why they changed his name to Amraphel, which is not a glorious title for sure. So the confusion that took place at the tower also took place in this city from which Nimrod ruled. That city was Shinar. The only way Shinar and Babel could both be the same city is could both be the first city that Nimrod built is for the name to be changed. So he named that place where the city and the tower was Babel, or confusion. He named that place where they were building the city and the tower. He named that place, and this is at the end of Jasher 9, Babel. And they left off building the tower and the city and were scattered to the four corners of the earth. But the city of, how did he leave off building Babel or Babylon? Because that city went on for over 1,000 years. Unless the city of Babylon's a different city. See, he named that place, the city and the tower that he left off building, that they were scattered from to the four corners of the earth, he named that place Babel. Then it said that he named another place Babel, and he named that other four cities. One was Shinar that was renamed Babel, and then the other three, he named them after the occurrences that took place at the building of the tower. Well, that's what it said again. They named these places after their names or the names of their children or after occurrences. And Jasher 9:37, and they ceased building the city and the tower, therefore he called that place Babel. He called that place Babel. What place? The place they ceased building. The city and the tower that they ceased building, he called Babel, and they were scattered from it. If you really want to understand it, it's important that you read these verses so you can see it for yourself. There's a whole verse there, or a whole chapter between there and what I'm about to read next. I'm not saying that there was a lot of time that took place here. It's just that in that one chapter, it's just covering the same information of what's happening, but it's establishing the fact that at least three of these cities, because it said he built cities, and then four of them were named after what took place at the tower, but one of them was the first city which he built. That's the one, Babel, which was renamed. It was Shinar, but it was renamed Babel, because we know the first city he built was Shinar. So it's just these other cities are establishing that they were named after what took place at the city and the tower that were not completed and that were abandoned, but they were named after the occurrences that happened there. And it's just establishing, if you read this, 9, 10, and 11, this establishing that this was something that happened after they had abandoned the city and the tower and been scattered into the four corners of the earth. It says in Jasher 11, 1 through 6, and Nimrod, son of Cush, was still in the land of Shinar, and he reigned over it and dwelt there, and he built cities in the land of Shinar. And these are the names of the 4 cities which he built, and he called their names after the occurrences that happened to them in the building of the tower. So they're being built, other than the first one that was already built, Shinar, which was renamed. These are built after, and you can read through these verses and see that these indeed are being built after they have been divided. And they're being named after what happened at the place that they just abandoned. So it's not the same place. There's 2 Babels or Babylons or places of confusion. The one that he ruled from, Shinar, he was still in the land of Shinar. He was still in the city of Shinar ruling. And then the actual city and tower that were being built that were abandoned. So there's 2 different Babylons. Then it says, and the name of the second called Erech, because from there God dispersed them. Well, no, they just built the city. They were dispersed and went and built all of these other cities. And Jasher 10 is telling about all these places they're going to. Everybody's going to their own prospective nation, building their own cities. And one of those was Erech. So they weren't scattered from Erech. Erech was one of the cities they built after they were scattered. Very clear. You can read that, Jasher 9, 10, 11. But it says they were named after what took place at the building of the tower and consequently being scattered from it. Clearly, they were not scattered from Erech. It was built after. It was named after what took place. And the third he called Eked, saying there was a great battle at that place. And the fourth he called Calneh. Now, it's possible there, but it said there was named after what happened in the building of the tower. And there was many battles that were described there in Jasher chapter 9. And so it was probably named after the battle that happened in the building of the tower, because that's what it just said. However, there could have been a battle there later at Eked, but it says specifically that was named after what took place in the tower. And Nimrod had built these cities in the land of Shinar. He placed in them the remainder of his people, his princes, his mighty men that were left in his kingdom. And Nimrod dwelt in Babel, which he always did. That was the first city he built. And there he renewed his reign over the rest of the subjects. The city of Shinar was the same city of Babel, or later known as Babylon, which is not the same city as the one that was abandoned and that they were scattered from, because this city went on for well over 1,000 years. The other one was abandoned. And 2 different places called confusion, or Babel, which is the same word for Babylon. And he reigned securely, and his subjects and princes of Nimrod called his name Amraphel, saying that at the tower his princes and men fell through his means. So that finishes our discussion on the land. I really wanted to go over and really cover this, because it took so long for me to be able to understand Shinar, because so little was actually said about it. And I literally had to just keep reading it and keep meditating on it and keep searching and keep on until one day it started to feel like common knowledge to me, to just become a part of who because I had to, because there's so little said about it. You have to understand that whole time frame leading up to it. You have to understand the history and the naming of all of these places, and in order to have a chance in a million of being able to understand something of which just a couple of words are said about. You just have to understand the overall time leading up to and surrounding this, the history surrounding this time, because it was changing. It was rapidly changing. The nations were being formed. The nations were being divided. There was wars. So I want to encourage you, because really I'm giving you the tools here for you to be able to read and understand this for yourself, and giving you the locations. I really suggest that you read Jasher chapter 7 through 16, and it's just fascinating to me to read and find out, okay, these kings that went in and waged war on Sodom and Gomorrah and the 5 cities in the plain and carried off Lot, this Amraphel character, that was Nimrod. I had no idea. I had no idea that was, Nimrod was even still alive at that time. I thought, this could have been thousands of years later. Had no clue. If you're interested at all just in the history, I encourage you to read that, and along with Genesis chapter 10 through 14 and Jasher 7 through 16. It's just so rich in history. It makes the Old Testament come alive when you actually can read it and understand it. It just really gives you a deep love for the Old Testament. I thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I'd encourage you to go back as you read these scriptures, go back and look over and watch and listen to it again. It's really was not easy for me to understand. I do understand it now. God's really opened my eyes to it, but I've had to apply myself. And I believe that you can do the same, but I don't think you will if you don't read it. So please do your own work. God bless you, and thank you for listening.